fundamentals of the Barbadian economy. And so we are boasting of 20 weeks of foreign reserves. We are making references to the fact that we have addressed our debt profile and the ratio to GDP is coming down, and significantly so. We have been managing the situation with reference to the primary surplus that we are aiming to achieve and carrying. We have been trying to boost revenues and reduce expenditure. And government's boast, therefore, has been with reference to some measure of success at the macroeconomic level before COVID. The other side of the story is, Mr. Speaker, that prior to COVID, and perhaps now more so, people in Barbados have been struggling. Businesses have been floundering before COVID. Bridgetown was closing down before COVID. Business people were crying before COVID. Default rates on loans were increasing prior to COVID, Mr. Speaker. Households were suffering. You are one of those members of Parliament who is often on the ground. I don't know if necessarily in St. Michael Central, but you're often on the ground. And therefore, you're absolutely familiar with what is going on out there. And you know, households were under serious stress. And many crying mothers were finding it very challenging to even feed their children, give them lunch money. I'm simply saying, prior to COVID, our situation was bad. After 2 years under this administration, it was still bad. Macro level fundamentals may have been addressed by various means, but on the ground where it matters, in the households across St. Michael West and St. Michael Central, and across urban Barbados and into rural Barbados, households, individuals were facing serious stresses, and businesses were floundering, and Bridgetown was reflecting a growing number of vacancies in terms of unoccupied buildings, formerly housing businesses in Barbados. This is before COVID. And I say that just to balance our reflection on context. Because yes, COVID has brought added stresses which must be addressed, but there were stresses in the Barbadian economy prior to COVID, and after 2 years of economic management of the current administration. I say that to suggest that what Barbados faces is the need to address the pre-COVID situation as well as the current situation brought on by the COVID pandemic. The pre-COVID economic situation in Barbados, the pre-COVID social stresses brought upon people, households in Barbados, they need to be addressed. Where they have been compounded, understandably so, by COVID, the attempt to address them is to be appreciated. Now, the specific issue before us has to do with this Catastrophe Fund. In very simple terms, I understand that government wants to make recourse to $50-odd million in a catastrophe fund set up for a specific purpose to ameliorate the circumstances of an element in the business community. And therefore, recourse is being made to this fund to facilitate business survivability and to ensure that the unemployment numbers can be reined in as far as possible. The businesses impacted by COVID will be getting some assistance, but that assistance comes to them in the form of a loan, interest-free loan, and stressed to be repaid in a year. That assistance comes to them via this mechanism, but through also recourse to a catastrophe fund set up to ameliorate the impact of natural disaster. I will never stand here and say it is imprudent or improper for any government to try to assist businesses which have been so impacted as many have in Barbados. I would never stand to say it is either imprudent or improper. What I do have a problem with is the way it is being done. And I do not believe that the justification offered by spokespersons for the government as to why a recourse should be made to the catastrophe fund in this instance is acceptable. I can only tell you how I feel. You may differ with me on that. I'm not saying don't try to support businesses. I'm not saying don't try to cushion employment, keep people in jobs, keep these businesses afloat, because the unemployment numbers are growing around us. They were growing before COVID. They're growing at a more alarming and faster pace and rate, understandably, now. So I support any attempt to help businesses stay afloat and employ Barbadian people, keep the economy going, keep government's revenues coming in. I support that. But I'm not too sure that the way to do it properly and prudently includes what I see as a raid on a catastrophe fund set up for a specific purpose. Justification given here is the government has negotiated an escape clause vis-a-vis its debt restructuring arrangements.
Mr. Speaker, as much as I like to give the Honourable Member certain latitude, I could not, in all decency, allow the Honourable Member to suggest that the government is mounting some sort of raid of the catastrophe fund. The pandemic that we are facing is a catastrophe of the world. There's no suggestion that it is something that's simple. It is not only a health crisis, it is a significant economic crisis. And if we have a fund set up there to protect the people of the country in a catastrophe of which we are in, then we have to be prepared to access it. It is not a raid, and for the Honourable Member to suggest that it is a raid of some sort is clearly misleading the House. And I would ask that that kind of language be struck from the record. I thank you.
I was surprised the Honourable Member was so brief. I don't support the approach of a raid on the catastrophe fund and the justification used as a premise for that. Mr. Speaker, if I may be allowed to repeat that. Now, the money is going from the Catastrophe Fund to businesses who have filed their VAT returns. I think it was said for 2 quarters of 2019 or something like that. You're talking, therefore, Mr. Speaker, probably a certain level of business operation in Barbados. Why not facilitate the loan from the same VAT payments if current existing legislative arrangements don't allow that? Why not change those arrangements? I repeat the question. If money is to be had to prop up businesses because of the impact of COVID, and it is to go to businesses who have been filing their VAT returns, and properly so and on time, who are in good standing with the VAT office, why not facilitate funding for the exercise from monies derived from VAT payments? Now, that I would want to think is a reasonable question. If there is some legislative arrangement which prohibits that, why not change the legislation in order to facilitate the same? Now, Mr. Speaker, you're doing this in a context where in recent times we have seen waivers of VAT owed to government approved. Matters like that have come before this very chamber. So you waive VAT payments, etc., for businesses. And you come and you take the money of the Catastrophe Fund to facilitate loans to businesses. My question is, can monies derived through payment of VAT be used to achieve the same purpose? And if there is any legislative mechanism which prohibits that, change that mechanism. But we've had waivers of multiple millions of dollars on VAT payment owed to government. It is public knowledge that there are businesses in Barbados that right now owe government a lot of VAT. Some may suggest, rather than raid the Catastrophe Fund, collect the VAT that has been long outstanding to government and owed by those who are known to government. My role here is to put the other side of the story, whether it is appreciated and valued or not by the other side present in here. But my role here is to put the other side of the story. And that is all, Mr. Speaker, I am attempting to do. I understand that the National Insurance Scheme is under stress with a rising level of claims. 43,000 and counting, we have heard this day. 1/3 of the workforce, we have heard this very day. I understand the need, therefore, to make every effort. It is a moral thing to do. It is a management thing to do. It's the right thing to do. I understand the need to prop up any business, legitimate business, that can afford to employ Barbadians and take some of the pressure under the National Insurance Scheme. So I don't decry that initiative to save the negative impact on the National Insurance Funds. I do not decry the initiative to keep businesses afloat or to employ Barbadians, and simply questioning mechanism which is being used to achieve that aim. And that perhaps alternatively, other approaches could be taken to achieve the same result. Mr. Speaker, the justification given is that there's $1 billion which, because of the negotiated escape clause in the restructuring arrangements, would be available to the government of Barbados, a lot of money, and that debt payment could be deferred over a period of 2 years. And therefore, monies would be available to, I don't know, Mr. Speaker, that $1 billion is immediately necessarily available to the government at a time when we need it. You may very well have a situation where disaster strikes, and it is of such a magnitude that you are faced with a situation where you neither have that $1 billion is earned by Barbados over time, where you neither have that, and you neither have the money in the Catastrophe Fund. That is a thing to be considered. The element of immediacy, the element of urgency. Mr. Speaker, if the whole of Bushall Yard Gap, near your constituency, or the whole of Savannah Road and Park Road is wiped out by some natural disaster impact, you want to know that there are funds available immediately and urgently so to the government to help with the response. You can't talk about monies that you are likely to have over a period of time. You have to make reference to the urgent moment and to the immediate moment. And therefore, we have to be careful what we do. You have payments to be made on your debt. Those payments are structured according to certain timelines. But you do not know when disaster necessarily will strike. And you may have paid up on your debts yesterday or last week. Disaster strikes this week. You have not the money from your debt payment, and you have not the money from your catastrophe fund. In layman's terms, that's where I am coming from. That is a concern which I think I need to express in this place. Now, it may offend the ears of some if I express it, but I have to do so and in clear terms, because there's always the other side to the story, or the other portion of the story that is not being told, or perhaps not being considered. Now, these issues have arisen in the past. What is the measure that triggers activation of this escape clause with reference to a system? What is a threshold that has to be reached in terms of intensity or measure relative to a system before that clause is triggered? We can be impacted by systems that don't necessarily meet that threshold. But the outflow, the impact, the damage can be such that the financial need in terms of the response that has to be made is enormous. I'm simply saying this escape clause, and we really ought to be given all these details, must have some threshold that triggers it in terms of the intensity or the measure relative to the impact of that, whatever natural disaster event it is upon Barbados. What if we are impacted by something of a lesser intensity or a measure which does not quite meet that threshold, yet the resulting damage is such that it calls for enormous amount of funds in terms of responding to the event. Now that's where I am coming from, Mr. Speaker. And the damage could be of such serious enormity that we don't have the capacity to respond depending on when the event occurs. Now, if those are not legitimate concerns, I'm sure that Honourable Member for Christchurch East Central, when he speaks again, will tell me, or the Honourable Member for St. James North, who I expect would speak on this matter, would tell me. I have a few questions, Mr. Speaker, that I would want to raise in the interest of Barbadians. Are we seeing reports from the National Insurance with respect to the operations of the Catastrophe Fund? I think under the legislation, from what I read, those reports are supposed to be coming with a certain measured frequency and should come to the attention of the Parliament and the public. I know in the past, in fact currently, we have issues with reporting coming out of the National Insurance Department with respect to other funds. But this one is managed by the National Insurance Scheme as well. I just want to know if we are actually seeing reports as to how the Catastrophe Fund is being managed. As far as I know, there's scope for investment of those funds, etc. And I don't hear anybody speaking to those matters, and perhaps this debate today allows either the honourable member who last spoke or the one who I imagine will next speak could possibly address that for us. Now, there is a requirement laid at the doorstep of insurance companies in Barbados, if it still obtains, that there is a catastrophe reserve fund of a certain volume to be held by insurance companies in Barbados. I don't hear these matters being spoken to. And that's another question. What is the level of compliance with respect to the catastrophe reserve funds, which insurance companies are obligated to hold in the event of a massive natural disaster impact, and for which they have some liability in terms of responding? And I don't ask the question just to use words. I ask the question because I think Parliament must concern itself about these things, and the public of Barbados needs to be informed and aware of and about these things. Mr. Speaker, I remember not too long ago, we had, in relative terms, a major incident, tragedy in Arch Court, Britton Hill. And there was so much attention given to the matter at that time, driven by a sense of compassion, empathy. The national interest in the matter was high. Government responded with its full force. I know much of that, it was embroiled in legal issues subsequently. Mr. Speaker, I have not heard anything to date as to whether full settlement was ever given with respect to that matter. I mentioned that in this context. One, some of the relatives come out of St. Michael West, but beyond that, we have a situation in Barbados where sometimes and often so judgments are rendered. Liability is incurred based on those judgments, but there's no enthusiastic and early follow-through. And situations like that are just left to lie. People suffer. It would have to be admitted that government, and I don't speak of the Barbados Labour Party government or former Democratic Labour Party government, I speak of government as an institution. We would have to admit that even government in Barbados has been guilty of that when they have owed monies to people and judgments have been rendered and payment is not followed through on. And I wonder how much of that exists out there in the insurance community. And so I don't raise that question lightly, but I raise it as a serious matter and hope that the minister who next speaks can respond to it. What level of compliance or non-compliance, if any, is there at the level of insurance companies with respect to that disaster reserve, catastrophe reserve requirement, if it still exists, which I would imagine that it does. The former administration, I was doing some reading, the former administration put a lot of store in recourse to something called CRIF, Caribbean Risk Insurance Facility, and relied on recourse to that in situations where there was some natural disaster impact on Barbados, and made recourse to that and benefited to some relative extent from funds through CRIF. My reading and research suggested that that is not altogether a prudent and substantially practical way to approach that matter, for the reason that though CRIF carries a low threshold in terms of what triggers a response from them financially, the response often in financial terms is relatively small compared to the damage that one may have incurred as a nation. Dominica's had that experience where they suffered billions, over $1 billion of damage, and got about $20 million through such a fund. And so I think it was being prudently suggested to the former administration that they move away from that to the extent that they can and build up this catastrophe fund. And I know the current administration in office, when it appeared to them or occurred to them that the former administration was making a raid on the catastrophe fund, this administration now in office, when then in opposition, railed against it. I'm just asking if we're still reliant to any extent on CRIF. I don't know. I'm asking Minister of Home Affairs, Honourable Member St. James North, would be aware of those things. Now, government has committed itself to a roof repairs program. You see, COVID has come and a lot of things have been left in our wake, fallen behind, and the danger is that they may be forgotten. And perhaps when he speaks, the Honourable Member for St. James North, and by this time he must know that he must speak, I would imagine that he would update us somewhat as to where we are with reference to this matter of the roof repairs program. And there's also a commitment to an insurance regime with reference to chattel houses. And these things we can't let drift, and we can't forget. Barbados existed before COVID, and God willing, by His mercies, we'll be here post-COVID. And these things must not be left eternally unaddressed. And I hope my honourable friend can speak to some of these matters when he stands. So, Mr. Speaker, I said I have to get in the habit of being brief, because church is now only 1 hour. I got to learn the art. I simply say, I don't oppose businesses being facilitated by government, because businesses must be kept afloat. If the economy is to be kept afloat, people must be employed. If households must be kept afloat, I don't oppose that. I just question the prudence of this way of doing it when perhaps other alternatives could be considered. Why raid the Catastrophe Fund to do it? To facilitate people who pay VAT, to give them a VAT-related loan, even though it be interest-free. That's all I'm saying. It seems to me that we could do this another way, because I'm fearful that we may find ourselves in a situation which we do not now see, that we neither have the monies we think we will have when the time comes, and we don't have the catastrophe fund at the same time. Yeah. You want the options? If you want the options, if you want the alternatives, when Parliament adjourns today, come 2 floors down. It's 1 floor down, 2 floors down, and sit with me. I thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I did give an option, by the way.
Honourable for St. James North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable, could you turn off your? Honourable for St. Michael West, could you turn off?
Oh, sorry.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition has essentially called me out to speak. I don't know. I think that this is quite clear. This amendment, or rather, in fact, new Catastrophe Fund Act that is being brought for the approval of Parliament today. The previous act, in fact, is a 2007 act, so which would have been piloted through this Parliament, in fact, when the Honourable Leader of the Opposition was part of the administration of the day. And in fact, he was a previous junior minister in the Ministry of Home Affairs and the Attorney General to the now Honourable Prime Minister, sir. So he would have been instrumental. He would have been instrumental in piloting and having this act passed through Parliament. A fantastic act, sir. Creative, an act which, in fact, by its definition of catastrophe, sought to give financial aid to persons who would have been victims of fire and hurricanes and earthquakes. And of course, since then, sir, we've had many. We've had Thomas, sir, which would have passed through. And many persons under the last administration, still even now, the roofs haven't been repaired, sir. That is the frank reality. So it is not any act that any right-thinking person who loves and cares about Barbados would oppose, sir. What we are seeking to do today, of course, is to widen the definition of catastrophe to include, for example, pandemics, sir. Again, there's no one in the world that can deny where the whole world, all 7 billion people are going through a pandemic, sir. And this is a war. This is a war, sir. The only thing, there are no bullets flying through the air, sir. But this is a war just like the war which, sir, neither, certainly I didn't experience 39 to 45, sir. Some in Parliament, sir, respectfully, and I respect their maturity and their advanced seniority, sir, would have been born, I think. No, not quite, sir. No, nobody in here, sir, have experienced it. I've heard my father speak about it, sir. And this is the similar kind of reaction, because it's a health pandemic that has direct repercussions on the economy, sir. And a government has to make choices. That is what a government is about, sir. And those who are criticizing the amendments, or rather the change in philosophy, or the widening of philosophy now of activation of a catastrophe fund, and just as they're criticizing, sir, the tremendous initiative of the boss, sir, are coming up, as usual, not coming up with any alternatives, sir. The leader of the opposition is making it seem that it is either that the government goes after people who owe VAT, companies, and these so-called big companies, as his senator in the other place spoke about yesterday, and he seems to be following on, sir, rather than leading on in terms of agreement. It isn't, sir, that you have dissections now in how we address this pandemic, sir, that you either go after people who owe VAT, or you deal with it this way, sir. You have to fight this war on all fronts, sir. Well, that is the point, sir. So I don't know what the honourable member, experienced as he is and being part of the last administration that brilliantly devised this whole concept, And we now looking to expand it to keep as many people in Barbados afloat. So all 30 of us here have been in our constituencies, sir. I in mine up to yesterday morning, sir. And it is bad. I mean, St. James North constituency, of which I have the pleasure to represent, in the middle of a tourist belt. Every household, effectively, has suffered at least one, in many cases 3 or 4 people who have now lost jobs. So, sir, in this amendment, in this new act now, sir, we are, for example, saying that self-employed people will be able to access these funds, self-employed people who have paid national insurance scheme. Those people don't have to show that they're registered with VAT, sir. And as we know, we have an informal economy, a lot of people working, so on beaches, self-employed people. The Honourable Member for St. James South will tell you, sir, that self-employment and small business is part of an engine of growth for any economy. In some cases, the major part. They're the kind of people we're seeking to protect and to still give a way forward and a survival mode for when we come out of this pandemic, sir. So you cannot laugh this off, sir, for opposition's sake and criticism, sir. And the Honourable Member, as I said, as a true former member of this government, sir, whose signature is attached to the People's Manifesto of 2018, sir, I do not want him, sir, or expect him to fall into the same category of persons who were comprehensively rejected at the polls last election, or losing all 30 seats by massive majority, sir. Don't get into that kind of tangle and that kind of company, sir. We have to rise above that as members of this Parliament, sir. The insurance fund, of which the Honourable Member asked questions, sir, is something that we are part of still as a government. We pay our premiums under that insurance fund. And in 2018, when Kirk passed through Barbados, sir, we were able to access insurance from that. If I remember correctly, it was about $6 million based on our membership of that fund and our payment of the premiums, sir. So it's not something that I certainly, or this government certainly will agree with the opposition, Honourable Opposition Leader, that we should not be part of. Because we can't be on the one hand calling on people, as we do, sir, to insure their private properties, but say that there is a CARICOM risk insurance facility. CARICOM, of course, the Caribbean region being the second most vulnerable region in the world to natural disasters, and we will not partake in it, sir. I don't think that is consistent with common sense or wisdom. So the fundamental basis of the initial 2007 Act remains in terms of persons who are affected by fire and hurricane, and of course helping the most vulnerable people, sir, in this event, because people who own property, chattel houses not valued at more than $150,000 and whose income is less than $25,000 annually, sir, will still continue to be able to access grants under this fund, sir. It isn't that is being done away with. So the perception that is being given by those who oppose for opposing sake that this is now going to facilitate big business and, you know, rich people, sir. We talking still about people with chattel houses, less than 150,000 people, sir. $150,000 earning less than $25,000 a year, of which many of those are constituents of the Honourable Leader of the Opposition too, sir, who's still benefiting from this. What we doing here today? So I don't understand the opposition's to this. And so, as I said, the Honourable Leader, I hope it's not a case where he's now looking to be led by his Honourable Senator in the other place, who in fact yesterday drew attention to the fact that there's no succession plan in the PDP. So, you know, sir, but we have bigger issues to worry about as a country.
Mr.
Honourable,
Speaker,
Honourable Mr.
the Honourable Member of St. James now must not so blatantly mislead yourself and this Honourable House.
Not myself. I'm listening carefully. I'm listening. But I'm listening carefully.
The Honourable Senator of whom he speaks spoke with reference to a trade union and not a party called PDP. And he should be honest about that one.
Understood, Honourable Member. Continue, Honourable Member.
Sir, so to wrap up, sir, because I don't think that I need to convince the people of Barbados that this, what we're doing here is within their total interest, sir. But, and I know the Honourable Member for Christchurch, East Central, who presented it, would also speak to this. But again, sir, we need to rid the minds of those objectors, and certainly it must never be in the minds of right-thinking Barbadians that this government has been party to, again now, writing off big businesses' VAT in registered judgments, sir. I mean, I've been a member of this cabinet. It's a privilege for the last 2 years, and I know of no case where any registered judgments against companies that owed VAT have been written off by this government, this cabinet, this parliament, sir. So, again, to give the impression that that has been done, quite frankly, is not within the spirit of Parliament, where veracity must always have pride of place. Sir, I am in full support of this act, which is before the Parliament. It gives greater breathing space, sir. We can't deal with what would happen if there is a storm which is not of hurricane force, and therefore we can't access those funds. A government can't operate in that manner. A government that is fighting a war, sir, that is fighting the greatest global health problem in a century, and now combined with a comprehensive global economic situation, and even worse than that 100 years ago, because the economy of the world, as we all know, and as the Honourable Member who presented and the Honourable Member for St. Michael, South Central would know better than all of us perhaps in here. The world is so intertwined in terms of its economy and its trade that a sneeze in China affects Barbados. That, you know, we do not have the choice now to say, look, just deal with it in this way but not this. We have to deal with it in all aspects. And this has been an extremely creative way devised by those who are mandated with the decision-making authority to come up with solutions for the survival of our people, sir. This is an extremely creative manner to widen the Catastrophe Fund to include those who are affected in other ways than through the traditional natural disaster, because what we're going through is just as much and even more catastrophe than any natural disaster. I'm obliged to you, sir.
Honourable Member for St. George North.
Mr. Speaker, sir, I shall observe the COVID rules because I believe that at this time we need to devise COVID rules so that members can really stick to the script and speak for no more than 2 or 3 minutes. And therefore, I will speak for 3 minutes today on this exercise. Mr. Speaker, since 1997, this bill was passed by the last Barbados Labour Party's administration, but nobody since 1997 was able to access a single cent of this fund. And under the previous Democratic Labour Party could not bring the regulations in place, and therefore persons could not access these funds at all. I hope at this juncture, because there's a new bill before us, where we are not only given to physical structures, persons with having fires or earthquake, because this year alone, I believe we had more than 30 fires across Barbados, and many persons have suffered because they lost their homes but cannot access these funds. And the intention was, because I was around in 1997 when we drafted this bill, when it came to Parliament, the intention was to help persons who had fires and no insurance, persons, natural disasters, all types. But I'm glad to see that the government has put in place a new section where businesses can now, and persons who are unemployed because of the either an epidemic, pandemic, or whatever you call it. I would like to see, though, that the government put in place a regulation where persons can access these funds in quick time. In some countries, and I refer to some developed countries, where businesses suffer, where you have a structure in place, and the businesses are named. So you have categories of service businesses, and you have categories of like construction and so on. I would love to see the types of businesses, for example, legal, medical, service industries, and so on. And you list them in categories where you give each business according to, you look at their profile and give them according to what they have been getting for maybe a year or two. I know in Toronto what happened, all lawyers and doctors and so on who had problems got an update, they got money up front. In 3 days, businesses who had to lay off their staff, and I'm aware in Barbados that some legal firms had to downsize, medical had to downsize. There are many persons in Barbados who could not pay their staff. There are many persons with apartments, Mr. Speaker, who tenants cannot pay. And I want to find out from the minister if these really include, because I saw in the newspaper really where a number of landlords were putting out their tenants because they could not pay. And I want to find out if these persons are entitled to grants, if they will get a grant or a loan. I know that the government is also planning to provide no interest loans, no interest on these loans, which is a good thing. The terms of grant, we need to specify what percentage of person's revenue or profits or losses that they will get, so that we need to, I hope that the committee that is put in place will do some of these things to ensure that businesses survive. I am aware, Mr. Speaker, that there are many young persons and maybe not so young persons who have gone back to work but who have now taken a cut, and some of them will be even sent home this week. There are a number of persons who cannot make it from day to day, and therefore this catastrophe fund is a good fund, and I hope that it can be implemented as soon as possible, because these are really rough days. Mr. Speaker, I'm obliged to you.
Honourable Member St. James South.
COVID rules.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I want to congratulate the Honourable Member for Christchurch East Central for the excellent speech that he made in introducing the bill and sharing with the country the importance of the Catastrophe Fund. I have to say that when he spoke about the fact that government has sought to use innovative ways, I really wanted to applaud very loudly, because in truth and in fact, this government, especially the economic team under the leadership of the Honourable Member for St. Michael North East, has come up with a number of innovative approaches to managing the crises facing Barbados that has enabled this country to be able to survive extremely difficult circumstances. This government, in all the history of Barbados, this government has faced more crises than any other government come into office to govern this country. That in 2 years, it has faced 8 crises, any one of which could have put the economy completely under. We came in and found the foreign reserves low. We had the fiscal deficit and an enormous debt that we could not manage. Sewage was on the street. The water system was on the brink of collapse. The infrastructure was in bad shape. You're talking about the roads, Mr. Speaker, the schools, the hospitals, the buses. Then you had the fact that we had to honor our commitment to converge our tax levels, our corporation tax levels, which saw the drop of our tax, corporation tax, from 25% down to 5%, which has an impact on government revenues. And then to top it off, in 2020, Mr. Speaker, we had the COVID pandemic. To tell you the truth, Mr. Speaker, it was like, and I've heard people say this, I cannot imagine what would have happened to this country faced with these crises had this government not been in charge of the reins of this country. I could not imagine the last government tackling this. Because COVID then, after the very hard work of our economic team, to be able to craft a number of initiatives to help us restructure our debt, to help us do things to assist the civil servants by a salary increase, to be able to put more in terms of welfare, more support, and then to try to restructure taxes so that it is spread out a little more and that everybody carried some load, that after we had set the scene for positive growth to take place in 2020, here comes the COVID pandemic, and we are suddenly faced with $450 million short in our revenue, as was shared by the Honourable Member for Christchurch East Central, 43,000 persons registering as unemployed, unprecedented. Tourism, the bottom of tourism just dropped out from under us, so that the foreign exchange we were hoping to earn, what taxi people were hoping to be able to make some money in this season that would take them through until the next season begins, all of that was gone. And in St. James South, I have a number of young women who've worked at these hotels, who suddenly found themselves at home with no money, with children to feed, and not knowing where to turn. Taxi drivers who were looking forward, as I said, to a great season, now had difficulty not only putting food on the table, were in danger of losing their taxis. And businesses struggling as they found it difficult to be able to put hands on cash to keep afloat while we were in a lockdown. So, Mr. Speaker, 3 things were needed urgently to be able to restore Barbados and to be able to safeguard the well-being of our people. In a situation like this, the top priority is how are we going to keep our businesses afloat so that they are viable, so that they can continue to provide the jobs They can continue to earn or save the foreign exchange, pay NIS and taxes. That's one of the most important things that must happen. How are we going to keep our businesses, large and small, afloat? Why is this important? Because their viability will allow for employment to take place, which will help to soak up the 43,000 people who are now unemployed. And those jobs are important because it allows people to eat, it allows people to pay their bills, it allows people to be able to pay their taxes and contribute to the NIS so that the health of the economy is able to be restored and to allow Barbados to move forward and to be able to prosper. Without the recovery of jobs, without the survival of businesses, government then would be placed in a severe crunch. They would have to see how they're going to reduce their expenditure and how they're going to increase their revenues so that they can plug that $450 million drop that they have in their earnings. Now, our future hangs on this being able to be achieved. And the innovative programs that this government has come up with are not only innovative, but the caring programs. Let me outline. We talked up welfare, recognizing that people were unable to make ends meet with prices rising and more people at home not working. So welfare was topped up by 40%. The provision of $600 for 3 months. Every month, $600 for 3 months to families without income. The $1,500 for the self-employed people who pay NIS. Also, the government spent a lot of money in relation to giving back VAT and income tax returns. Mr. Speaker, what we are discussing today is another such step in the innovative program for the restoration of Barbados, and that is the Catastrophe Fund. I know that the Honourable Member for St. Michael West expressed concern about why it was taken from the Catastrophe Fund to provide for the economic catastrophe that now faces all of our businesses in Barbados. But, sir, I know the Honourable Member for St. Michael East Central will handle that and deal with that in his wrap-up. Suffice to say that the effective and creative use of that catastrophe fund, given the fact that we had already provided for a catastrophe by the clauses that were included, as was shared by the Honourable Member, would take care of any catastrophe that we have. So therefore, what positive use then can be made of this catastrophe fund designed by government for the health of our businesses? First of all, I believe that as long as it is able to keep businesses afloat, we stand a better chance of when the recovery comes internationally, that we have the businesses necessary to grab that economic growth and convert it into good use for Barbados. But I want to put a warning. COVID-19 actually presents an opportunity for pushing a major reset button. And to those businesses who are going to apply to the Catastrophe Fund to be able to get resources to stay alive, it is necessary not just to take the money and run, but rather there's a need for a new national consciousness about how they go about doing their day-to-day business, that they must now focus on doing business in such a way as to promote the common good, so as to generate the economic energy that is needed for the recovery of our economy out of this dust. And what do I mean by that? Businesses who are looking to benefit from that fund should recognize that part of their survival depends on other businesses being able to employ people, and therefore people having the disposable income to come and spend with them. Therefore, when they are spending, when a purchasing manager is making decisions about where he's going to take goods and services from, when a general manager is making decisions about who will be his suppliers, it is imperative that these businesses focus on buying local first. That they look at the products that are made in Barbados, the services that are offered in Barbados, that by helping every other business to get back on its feet, they're actually creating the economic growth that will allow for further prosperity of their own businesses. Because the more people who are working, the more people who are spending, the more that business will benefit because the economy is thriving and it is recovering. So that new national consciousness must be there. Along with that national consciousness, there must also be a pivot that recognizes that, look, and it was said well by the Honourable Member for Christchurch East Central, that we have to not only look to our own well-being, we have to be conscious of the well-being in the region. That the OECS or CARICOM neighbors are important to our own survival. When we do the analysis of trade within the region, it is recognized that Barbados is one of the countries that does extremely well from the CSME. Our economy benefits to the tune of over $300 million because of our capacity to sell goods and services into the OECS and into CARICOM in general. Therefore, where goods or services are not available in Barbados, businesses, as a part of their pivot to support economic growth, should then look to the region to find their suppliers. Now, this may mean shifting the consumer from certain goods to other brands, but it's not impossible. If we as citizens and consumers and businesses together recognize that we have a common destiny, and recognize that if we are able to support each other throughout this COVID era, that we are going to create the conditions for our survival. Because believe me, nobody is coming to rescue us. We have to rescue ourselves. And therefore, it is very important that we support each other in the region. Now, sir, I just want to end by saying, I know today that there are discussions going on seeking to assist the public sector to appreciate and understand the value of the BOSS program. I consider that program to be a BOSS move. It is absolutely innovative and brilliant. And if Barbadians can understand what it means and participate where they can, and where they can't, recognize that the way it is structured is designed to be able to provide the opportunity for more jobs to be created in this economy. And I look forward to the opportunity to speak to it when it comes before this chamber. But I want to say to Barbadians, it will take more than the innovation of this government to get us out from where we are. It's going to require that every citizen, every consumer, every business person does what is within their power to do to help our economy to grow. And if we consciously spend our money in ways that helps other businesses to grow, we will be setting the road for our own success. So I want to encourage everyone, stay the course, do what you need to do to make Barbados a wonderful country again, in which our young people can look forward to a future and to prosperity. I'm obliged to you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member St. Michael South Central.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will be brief, I believe. I rise in support of the bill before this House because I believe that it demonstrates the extent to which this Barbados Labour Party administration has had to be innovative and also has had to take stock and make use of all of the tools at our disposal. I am particularly disturbed, though, by some of the utterances of the member for St. Michael West, the Honourable Leader of the Opposition. And while I am disturbed, I should perhaps not be surprised, because I do recall statements earlier being made that suggested to me that the Honourable Member would be seeking to use the unfortunate circumstances created by this pandemic to suggest that this government would not be equal to the task of response. And the utterances that I am referring to were earlier made suggesting that once COVID-19, once we feel the full impact, that this administration should not seek to blame any economic downturn on the pandemic, which to me defies reason and logic. Because it's not a question of blame. It's a question of transparency and honesty, being able to understand the nature of the impact, being able to understand that, in fact, the world, the modern world, has not seen anything of this kind before. Now, with reference to the issue of how we make arrangements or how we make provisions for the response to disaster, the Honourable Leader of the Opposition, in his Googling, I take it, because I Googled and found the same article that he made reference to. And I believe that it was SEDIMA, that regional CARICOM institution that is responsible for helping organize the region to be able to adequately respond to disaster, was cautioning that the CRIF is not a sufficient instrument for response to disaster. It doesn't mean that countries should not continue to subscribe to the CRIF, but this Barbados Labour Party administration has gone on record as saying that we are well aware that the CRIF is not a sufficient instrument. I believe the Honourable Member for St. Michael North East, the Honourable Prime Minister, referred to it essentially as a credit union, so that you can only benefit from what you are able to put in. And the fact is that as a region that is most affected by the impact of climate change, the global community cannot expect islands like Barbados, including islands in the Pacific, to be the ones who are responsible for also coming up wholly with the solution when we see the worst impacts of that climate change. So it is no revelation to this chamber or to Barbadians that the CRIF is not a sufficient instrument. We are happy that it exists. And we are also happy that the parametric triggers are not just about a major hurricane or a major weather event, but they're also things like extreme rainfall and so on. But the fact is that we have already made this statement publicly. It is the reason that not just Barbados, but the entire international community has sought to come up with new kinds of instruments. And right now, Mr. Speaker, sir, we are in the process of finalizing arrangements for Barbados to be a part of and have access to the Inter-American Development Bank's Contingent credit facility. Let me say a little bit about this contingent credit facility, because I believe that once this chamber and Barbadians understand what it is, that it would also shed some light on the extent to which the notion that we should not include a pandemic in the Catastrophe Fund response is a nonsense. If ever there was something that was a catastrophe, it is the COVID-19 pandemic. And in fact, the international community has responded by taking all of its similar instruments and expanding them to include pandemics. So it is not only Barbados that is realizing that in fact things like COVID-19 are by definition unforeseen shocks. They are disasters, they are catastrophes. The government of Barbados did not make that up. The whole world is shifting to reflect that understanding. And as a matter of fact, the contingent credit facility of the IDB was created very recently just for natural disaster. And at the time it was created only for natural disaster, the government of Barbados expressed an interest and started to negotiate to be included in this, what would be a rapidly dispersing fund after a natural disaster. So when it happens, when it hits, the country is able to bypass all of the regular processes and to immediately have access to liquidity. The climate resilience issue, the disaster preparedness and response issue is twofold. We have to build in resilience beforehand, but then we also have to make sure that we have access to cash after the fact. And so I do take the point of the Honourable Member for St. Michael West that yes, the CRIF was not enough. But the Contingent Credit Facility for Natural Disaster has two modalities as it stands now, and is now adding two further modalities. The first modality is for natural disasters, allows countries to access US $300 million, or 2% of the country's GDP, or whichever is less. So that is the response to the notion that the CRIF is not enough. Yes, the CRIF is not enough. And that is the reason that Barbados will now have access to this new facility. Rapid dispersing, giving us access to liquidity so that the kinds of things that people need, medicine, cleanup, making sure that we have business continuity and that people's lives can continue, that is what these resources will be made available for. But I go further. Based on discussions with its warring members, including Barbados, and especially Barbados, I dare say, there was a second modality added. So that the first modality covered only earthquake, hurricane, and extreme flooding. But the second modality, based on agitation and advocacy from this region and from Barbados, now includes storms, tsunamis, and droughts. And why does it include drought? Drought is something that is an effect of climate change. And while it is not necessarily related to a single event, the effects can be just as disastrous and just as catastrophic. We are living it now. We are living it in Barbados today. And we see that we are all affected. Farmers, anyone who has to be able to rely on the predictability of water supply is now affected by the fact that we are in extreme drought conditions. And the experts say that this is perhaps the worst drought that Barbados has ever seen. And so it is agitation by Barbados that allowed entities and international financial institutions like the IDB to include this as a parametric trigger. But they want to go further. Were it up to the IDB and others, they would also want to include slow onset events, things like beach erosion. They feel, again, based on representation made by us as tourism-dependent economies, that even though this is not based on an extreme weather event, it is one of those creeping impacts of climate change and should be considered as a parametric trigger in instruments such as this. But I want to say, in addition, Mr. Speaker, sir, that immediately when COVID-19 began to affect the economies in the region, the IDB, based on discussion with its members, added 2 further modalities. One was a COVID-19 modality just for this pandemic to allow countries to have very quick access to resources, to liquidity, in response to the catastrophe. And they are calling it a catastrophe. It's not just Barbados that's calling it a catastrophe. But they also went further. So they also have included a modality for health risks. That is what they're calling it. They haven't even said pandemic. Because more and more, the world is realizing that it's not just about natural disasters. That there's so many ways in which the people and the economies of a country can be exposed to an unforeseen shock that was not in anyone's control. So I hope that that outline gives some assistance to the Honourable Member for St. Michael West in understanding the definition of catastrophe. Because you don't have to Google it and you don't have to look in a dictionary. You just have to look around to see how it is impacting people in real terms, in real life. I will tell you that the first day that I went walking around in St. Michael South Central after we really started to feel the effects of the pandemic here, I happened upon some people liming outside a shop. There were many of them. And each one gave me the story of where they were working, the fact that they were let go, how many people in their household were also let go, how many people live in that household, how many of them are children who have to go to school. The fact is that the impact was immediate. It was deep and it was wide. You do not have to Google it to know that this is the definition of a catastrophe. And perhaps if the Honourable Member walked around in St. Michael West as much as his soon competition or already competition replacement does, he would understand the definition of a catastrophe. But I also want to make reference to another false notion that was represented by the intervention of the Honourable Member for St. Michael West. And that is the notion that while the government of Barbados has been able to respond rapidly to the pandemic, it is not also continuing to execute and implement its transformational agenda. That is a falsehood. And I remember going on record to say, in response to the idea that all of our measures should be relief measures, there was this discussion that a government should only focus on relief at this time. And I said that we will focus on relief, but we are not going to lose sight of the compact that we made with the people of Barbados to deliver transformation to this country, because it is a compact and it is a promise that is 10 years needed. That for a decade prior to 2018, this country had not seen any hint or any effort to try to transform people's lives in a real way, and that this Barbados Labour Party administration would not let go of or lose sight of that compact that we made with the people of Barbados. And so this notion that the roof rebuilding program and the other transformational programs that we've begun, that we are somehow letting go because we are dealing with a pandemic. This Barbados Labour Party administration can walk and chew gum and skin coffins and climb trees. It is not one or the other. That might be true of the Breadfruit Party and the Golden Apple Party and the others. But it is not true of this administration, Mr. Speaker, sir. And so we responded rapidly with the programs that the Honourable Member for Christchurch East Central outlined, with support from the member from St. James South. But we are also continuing to execute government's transformational agenda. And so the Roofs to Reach program that we have spoken to the country about is continuing its execution. With the help of the Green Climate Fund, we are setting up in the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Investment a small body of experts with grant resources from the Green Climate Fund, because the Green Climate Fund has seen the project, believes in it as transformational, and has agreed to give us the grant funding to take it forward. But within that, what the Ministry of Housing has also been able to do is to receive proposals for climate resilient housing, including roofs, so that we can make sure that this model of housing that we ultimately agree on nationally is the one that we would give priority to, and is the blueprint for how we build resiliently in the country. The roof replacement program is continuing with the support of the Urban Development Commission and other responsible agencies in the country. We know, as we have seen in the past days and weeks, that often issues of housing stock, security and safety of housing stock, these are often related to issues of land tenure. These are often related to all kinds of issues that we have to work through with Barbadians to help people regularize and make whole whatever their particular status is in terms of the lands they occupy or the homes they occupy. We understand that it is a process, and it is one from which we do not shirk. But the truth is that these are often multifaceted issues that have to be worked through. And we have said that in this third decade of the 21st century, we cannot ignore the fact that there are certain things that have to be human rights. And to the extent that they are human rights, that there's a basic social floor below which nobody should fall, that we also have to make sure that there are not these kinds of structural barriers to people being able to access water, being able to access a secure physical living conditions, secure homes, secure roofs, etc. And we continue on that agenda, sir. But I want to say that perhaps what some people are now seeing for the first time in many years is a government that understands what an instrument is, what a tool is, what are the options at its disposal, and how to make use of them in conversation with the people of Barbados. We have not tried to hide and do anything. There isn't anything that anybody will discover 4 and 5 and 7 years later, or when you try and go and dig and finally get the data from a particular agency. This is one of the most consultative and inclusive governments I have certainly seen in my lifetime in this country. And so I hope that that short intervention has shed some light more than Google could on the kinds of things that this government is doing as part of an entire ecosystem of disaster and catastrophe response. To be able to give the people of Barbados the assurance that we are not just planning for now, we are planning for the future, we are planning for coming generations of Barbadians, and that together with the people of this country, we got this. I'm obliged to you, sir.
Honourable Member for St. Philip North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to be short as usual. First of all, I want to thank the Honourable Member for Christchurch East Central for his great presentation. And I would also like at this time to thank the Honourable Members for St. Michael South Central, who made it more or less come alive for me. I think many members of the country would be pleased at what she had to say about the inclusiveness of the Catastrophe Fund. I want to bring it down now to my constituency level at this point. I am one that believes in prophylaxis and repair rather than waiting on the emergency situation to happen. And while I do appreciate the Catastrophe Fund, I'm in great support of it, well needed and instituted by now. I am appealing to the relevant ministry to have a look at the list that we would have sent in with house repairs. Right now I have constituents in St. Philip North where I could stay at the front of the house and look through the house to see the backyard. I need this to be done urgently. We are now in the hurricane season, and I would wish not to wait to use the Catastrophe Fund to look at things like this. House insurance is an area that I would like to see. I don't know how to do it, extended to the poor section of our communities. The truth is a lot of us cannot afford house insurance. Whether it's wall or wood, cannot afford house insurance. I am not sure how we can negotiate with the insurance companies. I am not sure what we can do, but it deserves another look at. As part of the disaster management too, I would like to use this opportunity to bring up the roads in St. Philip North. I know I was told by the Honourable Member for Christchurch West that we had enough. But the truth is we don't. And I want to use this opportunity to push a little bit for the so-called private roads. There are a number of so-called private roads in St. Philip North that are currently used by many public people. And it's on the books, the legislations, that we are not allowed, correct me if I'm wrong, to repair these roads. I think it's grossly unfair. I have houses, 10, 20 people living on the street. I can name at least 3 in St. Philip North that they have been fighting with successive governments to have a little help with the roads. I'm appealing at this point. Ruby, Long Bay, Sanford, there are many of them. There's also an area in Fortescue. I've been hearing calls, getting bills for some of it. Fortescue is an area where there's one entrance. If something, definitely the disaster fund will come in there, the catastrophe fund. There is only one entrance to a community that houses several thousand people. I need that looked at as well. And now I have the opportunity. I know the Honourable Member for St. James North spoke, and I was hoping that he would bring up something with respect to the hurricane shelters. St. Philip North now has 4 Category 1 hurricane shelters, one being public, Hilda Skeens Primary School. I had a look at it, and I am noting that they are more or less in a cluster. In other words, members of almost 3/4 of St. Philip will find it difficult to get to these areas. They service more the 6 Roads area in that vicinity. In other words, we have areas, Blaze Hill, Three Houses Hill, Bayfield. I can name quite a few thickets, parish land, vineyard that cannot get to any of these Category 1 shelters if something were to happen. So it may be worthwhile putting some funding into fixing maybe a couple of these schools or churches to get them up to scratch. I am happy to see that the self-employed persons are being included in this. What I would say, though, that I think a lot of people, a lot of private workers, self-employed workers have been hearing the regular ads on TV or wherever about paying NAS contributions. Fantastic. But I don't think many of them realize that it is limited in terms of what they get at the end of it. In other words, I think the benefits need to be extended to sick leave. Self-employed people do get sick. And I don't know if that it was a glitch at the NAS. Self-employed people do get ill. They get ill and we need a little support. I was smart enough or got enough advice to know that I needed to put myself as an employee of my business, but there are many people, fishermen, maids, other people that paid as self-employed, and they get sick. And nothing is coming in to support them during that sickness. That could be as short as 2 days, but we don't get after 2 days as long as months, depending on what is happening, and they do pay. As I said, I'll be short. I want to use this opportunity to thank from the bottom of my heart the Sandy Lane Children's Trust. Without them, life would be a lot harder. I was able to service through them a couple hundred so far of my community, despite the negativity that she's not opposition, what are they now? The now defunct Democratic Labour Party government had to say and brought in things like racism and so on, when they know for a fact that they would benefit from the Sandy Lane Trust. I want to say thank you. I want to say thank you for the vouchers. Mothers are now able to buy baby milk for themselves. I am going to put in a pitch here towards the Honourable Member for Christchurch East Central, and I know he heard it before, with respect to doing something about the costing of sanitary items, obviously for women. I support it. I've been hearing several members of the community complain about VAT on some of these items. And these are things, if you're unclear what I'm saying, sanitary pads, tampons, that kind of thing. Yes, Honourable Member, they are necessary and we need to do something about the costing. Right now there are a lot of people coming out of COVID that really cannot afford it and you really can't do without it. Have a look at that. I don't know that the Sandy Lane vouchers would suffice for that because it's a children's charity. But these are common basic things that we need to address, regardless of how petty it might sound. We need to address those. I want to say a few words with respect to the renters, people that rent and were unable to pay because of COVID or even longer. There needs to be some. Yes, there are some I have that experience myself that just would not pay because they just chose not to. They know their rights. They know that you can't put them out and everything. But there's some that are suffering right now on the brink of being expelled out of their rented homes. I don't know what can be done. I think we need to have a backup plan with respect to things like this, with respect to disasters, with respect to people being put out of their homes. If every constituency or parish can have an area where there are, you don't want to leave houses empty forever, where there can be a backup. Emergency situations, housing necessities, that kind of thing. Well, I am still mindful that landlords still have to pay their land taxes and utility bills. I'm very mindful of that, but the government needs to come in where necessary to help out some of these people that are on the brink of being put out. That being said, I promise to be short as usual, and I've come to the end of my speech. Thank you very much.
Honourable for Christchurch East Central.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I wish to thank all honourable members for who contributed to this debate. And it is an important one, certainly in the circumstances. I will just respond to a few questions raised, just to provide absolute clarity for the Chamber and certainly for the country. When COVID hit, and I think as the Honourable Member for St. Michael South Central clearly articulated, it was absolutely immediate, Mr. Speaker. And the harsh reality is that businesses and employees came to almost an abrupt halt with respect to incomes, salaries, wages, whatever you call it, sir. And representation was made to us with respect to the suspension of some of the statutory obligations, which includes national insurance payments on behalf of workers to improve cash flow. Some businesses wanted to suspend VAT to government, and obviously all kinds of things in response to what clearly was an extraordinary circumstance. And we had to look, certainly, sir, and consider everything that was put to us, given that we do operate on the basis of consultation. And obviously, given the anticipated reduction in revenue to government, and considering that at a time that whilst everything had been withdrawn from businesses and individuals by way of income and cash to businesses, as well as salaries to workers, that government's response had to be ramped up. So we cannot ramp up, sir, our response to people if there was a suspension of payments of any type to government, because then we wouldn't have the cash flow, sir, to be able to respond. So we had to respond to people fairly, and therefore what the honourable member for St. Michael West indicated about whether or not you could use the VAT funds to loan back to the to the persons really, sir, would just have opened a wider gap in government's ability, fiscal position, and therefore would imperil the government's ability to respond. So we looked at the use of the Catastrophe Fund, as the member for St. Michael South Central said. We had a tool, an instrument available to us to use, and we're using it. And therefore we came to the chamber here today, sir, to give the legal authority to be able to do that, as you can appreciate, because it is an extraordinary circumstance. And the truth is, sir, this instrument will only be used in the context of a pandemic or some national catastrophe that impacts, obviously, a wide cross-section of people. So to suggest that to use those businesses who will continue to pay a VAT into the government, which now has to service a whole set of other needs, would just imperil the cash flow for government and our ability to respond. So we indicated to them that we could not, at this stage, consider any deferral with respect to commitments, whether it's national insurance or what have you, even though there are a few elements in other parts of the program directly that can do that. But as it relates to government's cash flow, we were not in a position to do that. Permit me, sir, permit me, in response to the honourable member's question about the natural disaster clause, just to read from, and this would have been the debt holders bill that we would have debated in the chamber, sir, on April 30th of last year, in respect to debt restructuring. So I will just read the clause, sir, and respond to the honourable member. And it says the exchange instruments to be issued. This is the natural disaster clause. The exchange instruments to be exchanged to individuals as part of Government of Barbados' exchange offer will include a clause that will offer both creditors and the Government of Barbados some protection against future debt distress caused by a major natural disaster. This natural disaster, in inverted commas, sir, clause would allow for the capitalization of interest and the deferral of scheduled amortizations falling due over a 2-year period following the occurrence of a major natural disaster. The trigger for a natural disaster event would be a payout to the Government of Barbados above a predetermined threshold by the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility, CRIF, under the Government of Barbados Catastrophe Insurance Policy. For further details, full details will be provided in the offer letters to the holders of the affected debt. So, sir, we included the natural disaster clause. I was looking on my iPad for. I know that we last year we increased the coverage that we under the insurance policy. So, with respect to CRIF, to be able to ensure that we have as comprehensive as possible a response. And as the member for St. Michael South Central indicated, we all know, sir, that CRIF, like the Catastrophe Fund, is not enough in the event of a major disaster. And therefore, that's part of the reason why we included the natural disaster clause in the bonds, to give us that space to be able to respond when Tropical Storm Kurt passed. It was last year, the year before. Is 2 years now? Is that? Oh, sorry, the time is flying. When Tropical Storm Kurt passed, sir, Dorian was last year. Yes. And as the member for St. James North indicated, we received a payout from CRIF of just over almost $6 million in that respect. And that was related to the flooding that we would have experienced at that particular time, sir. And therefore, the trigger with respect to being able to suspend your bonds are already built in, sir, to the bond structure, so that if there is a major disruption, sir, caused by a natural disaster, we would know. And it will not be a discussion, sir, whether or not Barbados has been impacted or not, or was the severity, sir. The reality of the situation is that we are using the tools that are available to us, sir, to create the space that we require to respond to people's needs. And we will continue to do that, and whatever legal framework is required to allow the government to faithfully execute on behalf of the people, sir, we will come to this chamber, or virtually, or in whatever form that we need to come to discuss these things, sir, to be able to ensure that you can do the people's business. So I hope that has clarified for the honourable member the natural disaster clause. Just let me say quickly, sir, as it relates to the write-off in relation to VAT. You would recall, sir, that the VAT was introduced in 1997. We came to office, sir, and at a time when the BRA was transitioning from the old systems into the new TAMIS systems in relation to the taking of the balances forward. And therefore, we wrote off, sir, all of the taxes that were due and owing prior to 2000 from an accounting perspective, so as not to bring those into the balances with respect to the Revenue Authority. So any suggestion that somehow the other we wrote off VAT for big business and this kind of like some nefarious purpose that we were getting into, as imputed by the honourable member for St. Michael West, is not has no basis in truth or fact, and therefore to recognize that with a number of entities and persons who have been since deceased, that it made no sense holding on to liabilities that you have no capacity to collect. So I'll leave that there for what it is. In effect, sir, the Catastrophe Fund represents for those persons who are whose incomes are below 25,000, pretty much represents, sir, that insurance type policy from a general insurance perspective, given that everybody when they work and pay the national insurance contributions would in fact contribute the 0.1% of the insurable earnings, and the initial intent was to provide that given the difficulty that some persons were having with respect to getting insurance for especially chattel houses at the time. And so it is critical that, one, we assure the public that will still continue. We will work and have been working with the insurance companies, which I do know provide coverage for chattel houses as well. And therefore, it's something that people just need to be able to recognize that it is important that you, no matter what, sir, and as we are seeing here, whether it's the Catastrophe Fund, whether it's the natural disaster clauses, whether it is the government using other means or other resources, that we have to look at the solutions from a multi-pronged approach. So, because you can never ever depend on any single thing, sir, to be able to respond to a circumstance. Let me just, for clarity, sir, and the benefit, to just say to the public through you, sir, and as we have introduced the business cessation benefit for self-employed person, just going to go through very quickly, sir, what are in fact the benefits that self-employed people already are entitled to once they make contributions to the national insurance scheme. And And any person can go to the NAS website, nas.gov.bb, and see it laid out very clearly. So all persons who make contributions as self-employed persons will benefit from the sickness benefit, sir, the maternity benefit and grant, and I know that once we settle on the issues related to paternity, that the paternity too would be included there. Funeral grant, sir, the invalidity pension, old age contributory pension or grant, as well as survivor's benefit. The only difference between this and any other, well, not government employees, but private sector employees would obviously be the unemployment benefit. That is the only difference between that and what other persons will have. So self-employed persons making their contributions are entitled to these suite of benefits, and therefore I encourage all self-employed persons to get themselves right, because getting yourselves right allows us, the government, to make policy decisions in these circumstances. And the reality of it, sir, is that, as you know, we have had to, because of the circumstances, provide through the Household Survivor Program, $600 to households where there's no income, no pension, no person working, no person self-employed, no person having any income for that matter. And the reality is that with the business cessation grant in place now, and as we expect the economy to open back, sir, that the reality is we want to signal to people that if you are indeed self-employed, that you have to make yourself right with the national insurance scheme, which allows the government to make policy decisions. If you are not going to benefit from the business cessation grant as a self-employed person, then you will be under the conditions with respect to the $600 for the household. And the reality is that you can't want something and not contribute to it as everybody else is doing. And therefore I urge, sir, I urge all self-employed persons to get themselves right as it relates to the national insurance, as well as with the BRA. But in this particular matter, obviously it's critically important that it allows the government to make policy decisions based on the circumstances, and therefore you have to be in a position, you have to be compliant with the obligations that are on you as a citizen in the country in order for us to be able to move forward and settle. And so, sir, I am proud to bring this piece of legislation here today to allow the government to move forward within the context of the law, even though I know that we have made decisions in the past in the spirit of responding to people. We have a greater responsibility to ensure that we can bring the society along. This is one aspect, as I said, of our response to COVID, and the Ministry of Finance, as well as the other agencies and ministries involved, will bring the appropriate legislation to ensure that we are always on the right side in terms of the law with respect to the execution on behalf of the people in Barbados. And so, sir, with those few words, I'm obliged to you. I beg to move that this bill be read a second time.
Beg to second that.
Question is that the aforementioned bill be read a second time. All those honorable members in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Me think the ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that you do not leave the chair and the House resolve itself in committee for further consideration of this bill.
The question is that the Speaker do not leave the chair and the House resolve itself into committee for further consideration of this bill. All those honorable members in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Me think the ayes have it.
This house is now in committee.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that clauses 1 to 5 stand part.
Ready to second that, ma'am.
Question is that clauses 1 to 5 stand par. All honourable members in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
All honourable members against, please say nay. Methinks the ayes have it.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that clauses 6 to 10 stand par.
Ready to second that, ma'am.
Question is that clauses 6 to 10 stand par. All honourable members in favour, please say aye. All those against, please say nay. Methinks the ayes have it.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that clauses 11 to 14 stand par.
Ready to second that, ma'am.
Question is that clauses 11 to 14 stand par. All honourable members in favour, please say aye. All those against, please say nay. Methinks the ayes have it.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that the first schedule be the first schedule to the bill.
Ready to second that, ma'am.
Question is that the first schedule be the first schedule to the bill. All honourable members in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
All those against, please say nay. Methinks the ayes have it.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that the second schedule be the second schedule to the bill.
Ready to second that, ma'am.
Question is that the second schedule be the second schedule to the bill. All honourable members in favour, please say aye. All those against, please say nay. Methinks the ayes have it.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that the third schedule be the third schedule to the bill.
Ready to second that, ma'am.
Question is that the third schedule be the third schedule to the bill. All honourable members in favour, please say aye. Aye. All those against, please say nay. Methinks the ayes have it.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that you do not report to His Honour the Speaker the passing of one bill in committee.
Ready to second that, ma'am.
Question is that I do not report to His Honour the Speaker the passing of one bill in committee. All honourable members in favour, please say aye. Aye. All those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
The chairman of committee has reported the passing of one bill in committee.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that this bill be read a third time.
Ready to second that, sir.
The question is that the aforementioned bill be read a third time. All those honourable members in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that this bill be now passed and cited as the Catastrophe Fund Act 2020.
Ready to second that, sir.
The question is that the aforementioned bill be passed and so cited. All those honourable members in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. This bill is passed and so cited. Honourable Leader, Government Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg to move that the sitting be suspended until 3:15. Sorry.
Until?
3:15.
The question is that this honourable chairman will be suspended until 3:15 p.m. All those honourable members in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. This honourable chairman stands suspended until 3:15 p.m.